Hello, and welcome to this Rain Taxi virtual event featuring Arthur Sze. I'm Eric Lorberer, the director of Rain Taxi. If you don't yet know about us, we are a nonprofit organization that champions aesthetically adventurous literature. Our work revolves around a quarterly magazine of critical writing. And this is our brand new summer issue I'm holding up. If you would like to hold it too, we would love to mail you a copy. Check out our website anytime after today's event and see if you might be interested. You might want to even become a Rain Taxi member and get all our forthcoming issues sent to your mailbox as well. Another way we advocate for literature is through events like this one. Tonight's Rain Taxi event, like most of ours, is free to attend, but if you're able to pitch in a little something, please feel free to use the donate button at the bottom of your screen. We're privileged to receive funding from places like the National Endowment for the Arts and the Minnesota State Arts Board, but our most vital supporters remain individual readers like you. There are lots of other ways to participate. Keep the chats coming. We see there's lots of great comments there. There's also an Ask a Question box, so if you have a question for Arthur tonight, feel free to put it there and we'll try to get to those. And then my favorite button of all is the Buy the Book button. And if you hit that tonight, you will be taken right to the ordering page for the Glass Constellation at our partner bookseller Majors & Quinn here in Minneapolis. And while you're there, if there are other books you need, feel free to use that same area and search around and buy books from that great independent bookstore, because anything you purchase tonight does help our series. Holding this up, it's just my thrill to welcome to the screen Arthur Sze, a poet we have so long admired, and it's in the documents to prove it because he is the very first person who read for Rain Taxi's fledgling series nearly 25 years ago. Arthur, welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's such a treat, and to celebrate this is amazing. When we first met, it was actually on the cusp of your first collected poems coming out, and that was a treat because readers got to catch up with where you had been and where your journey had taken you. But now this, the fact that this celebrates 50 years of writing is astonishing, and so congratulations and thank you for this. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's, again, a pleasure to be here. And I remember coming to Minneapolis. I think I read at the Weinstein Gallery. It was your first reading, and it's been a great journey for both of us.
Yeah. Oh, what a pleasure to follow a poet all these years. Since this does, bring to mind the entire arc of your career, and kind of serves as a profound reminder that, wow, your first book came out in 1972. You were a relatively young person at that time. I want to do a little time travel with you and talk about those years because, again, when I first started reading your work and thought about that history, I was seeing all sorts of development in your work that I thought were focused on kind of the increasing value of poetry in our culture, the formation of the National Endowment for the Arts in the mid-'60s, for example, the beginnings of poets in the schools, the inheritance of the beat culture, all those things, the emergence of eco-poetics and the growing recognition of multiculturalism, all things that were teased out in the course of your work over the years. But this past year, and all that's happened, I've also been reminded about the challenges of that time. The Vietnam War is going on, and you're of draft age at that time. The Kent State shootings, all sorts of pressures in the world that a young poet is certainly reacting to. So I'm just curious, what was part of your drive at that tumultuous time to stake out a career in poetry?
Let me backtrack and just say, a lot of people who have read interviews that I've done know that I started writing poetry actually at MIT, and I call myself a science dropout, though, science is important to me. But, in 1968, when I was a freshman at MIT, the Vietnam War social protest was very much on everyone's minds. I happened to start writing when I was bored in the calculus lecture, and I just looked away from the whiteboard and opened up a notebook and started writing. And pretty soon I was writing all the time. But the next year, in 1969, Denise Levertov came and taught a combined MIT-Harvard poetry workshop, and she had just come east from the University of California at Berkeley. And, I'd never been west of Pennsylvania in my life, and Denise was like, every third sentence was, in Berkeley, this is happening, in San Francisco, that's happening. And I thought, well, I know I want to transfer, and I don't know where, but because MIT isn't the place for poetry. And so that's how I decided to transfer to University of California at Berkeley. And I arrived there in 1970. I hitchhiked across country, actually, and I created my own major in poetry. So those were times of a lot of social unrest and protest and transformation. But I also feel like I benefited from that milieu because it really made me ask myself, what do I really want to do? And though I was good at math and science, and though I had as an Asian American, a lot of pressure to do something safe and professional, it was sort of like, well, are you going to be a scientist or an engineer? It wasn't like anything else. When I decided I wanted to be a poet, I think the unrest of the times was part of that. It helped me find my way in a way. Things opened up with lots of possibilities.
Right. And did your migration from the East Coast to the West Coast draw new flavors out as well? Yeah, it feels to me that they're almost, maybe especially at the time, two different American experiences happening there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I had spent my whole life on the East Coast, basically, New York, Cambridge, up and down the East Coast, and to go out to California was a revelation, and it was very, very exciting. And it was, poetically, I had friends who were had tapes. In those days, people had tapes, right? Recordings of the Berkeley Poetry Conference.
Oh,
So
wow.
I remember hearing, Charles Olson, Robert Creeley, Robert Duncan on tape, and then, of course, seeing them at live events in the Bay Area. So it was a very exciting time.
Yeah. And who became your teachers out there? The educational community that you plugged into as you started this journey in poetry?
So the poet mentor who was really crucial to me was Josephine Miles. I'm going to make a little jump here. Years later, when I had the pleasure and honor of traveling in Taiwan with Derek Walcott, Derek one morning said to me, he said, the path of a poet is really a struggle. It's difficult. And Derek said to me, in my experience, there's always someone behind the poet who says, this is worth doing. And he said, my mother was that for me. And he asked me, well, who was it for you? And I had no hesitation in saying it was Josephine Miles, because when I transferred to UC Berkeley, I had science credits, humanities credits, I had taken some writing classes, but I didn't really fit into an English major. I wanted to translate classical Chinese. And I remember showing up at Josephine Miles's office. I was in her poetry workshop saying, I don't know how I'm ever going to graduate because I don't have any of the English credits. I'm already transferring in as a junior, and I want to take Chinese and I want to take philosophy. And she somehow believed in me, and she said, look, I'm a university professor, take whatever you want and I'll sponsor you. Just create your own major in poetry. So that's what I did for the next 2 years.
What a gift. That is great. And yeah, can't say enough about the importance of teachers. So thank you for that anecdote. I want to return to some of the themes that you talked about there, but I also want to start peppering in some poems. I'm just dying to hear you read again. And I wonder if maybe you'd start us off again with a little time traveling. back to, well, it's from your fourth book, but the poem, The Unnamable River.
Sure. Let me just say that when I put River, River together, which is my fourth book, it has no section dividers. And that book was really important to me. It was kind of like this flow and overflow and sense of simultaneity and being immersed in a whole world. And so in my evolution, River, River, which is, entirely in the Glass Constellation, is a pivotal book. And this is the last poem, The Unnamable River. 1. Is it in the anthracite face of a coal miner, crystallized in the veins and lungs of a steel worker, pulverized in the grimy hands of a railroad engineer? Is it in a child naming a star, coconuts washing ashore, dormant in a volcano along the Rio Grande? You can travel the 4,000 miles of the Nile to its source and never find it. You can climb the 5 highest peaks of the Himalayas and never recognize it. You can gaze through the largest telescope and never see it. But it's in the capillaries of your lungs. It's in the space as you slice open a lemon. It's in a corpse burning on the Ganges, in rain splashing on banana leaves. Perhaps you have to know you are about to die to hunger for it. Perhaps you have to go alone into the jungle armed with a spear to truly see it. Perhaps you have to have pneumonia to sense its crush. But it's also in the scissor hands of a clock. It's in the precessing motion of a top when a torque makes the axis of rotation describe a cone, and the cone spinning on a point gathers past, present, future. 2. In a crude theory of perception, the apple you see is supposed to be a copy of the actual apple. But who can step out of his body to compare the two? Who can step out of his life and feel the Milky Way flow out of his hands? An unpicked apple dies on a branch. That is all we know of it. It turns black and hard, a corpse on the Ganges. Then go ahead and map out 3,000 miles of the Yangtze. Walk each inch, feel its surge and flow as you feel the surge and flow in your own body. And the spinning cone of a precessing top is a form of existence that gathers and spins death and life into one. It is in the duration of words, but beyond words. River, 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 river. The coal miner may not know he has it. The steel worker may not know he has it. The railroad engineer may not know he has it, but it is there. It is in the smell of an avocado blossom and in the true passion of a kiss.
Oh, so beautiful. Thank you for that. And that kiss, like all the best kisses, is such a surprise at the end. Wow. Well, as you said, that book was a pivotal book for you, and certainly the last poem in a great collection of poetry gives the reader that jumping off point into the potential that's coming. So I feel one of the pleasures of reading through a collected is that ebb and flow, that stepping into the tides of time, and what you describe in the poem as the past, present, future motion that's always happening. I have a copy of the original. And one thing I noticed as I was looking at your books is the blurbs on this book are from Robert Creeley and Jackson McClough. And I think there's something beautiful there. Of course, it's on Lost Roads Publishers too, and I think it must have represented a growing sense of community. So I'm curious about that. Not just because these great elders are praising you, but it seems to me it's expanding your sense of the poetic community or your participation in it. And I'm just curious, what was that like from your side of things at that time?
Well, I wrote the poems in River River between 1980 and 85, basically. So I was pretty well situated in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I met Robert Creeley, who was living in Placitas then. While I was in Santa Fe, we were invited to read at an art gallery in downtown Albuquerque. It was part of a renewal of downtown Albuquerque. And Bob was very sweet. I'd never met him before. And I talked to him on the phone and I said, we'll meet at the reading. And he said, "You'll do no such thing. You're coming over for dinner at my house in Placitas. And then we're going together to read in Albuquerque." And, we ended up becoming fairly good friends. And I would see him whenever he came back to New Mexico. And so, yes, it was part of this excitement and discovering and making connections with the community of poets in New Mexico. And Jackson McClough I met through a friend in Berkeley. Jackson was living in New York City, and Jackson's poetics were always slightly baffling, wonderfully fascinating, and always exciting for me. And I loved meeting Jackson and talking to him. And he was always trying to figure out ways to write a kind of poetry that was less ego-centered and without maybe being, a Buddhist per se, but, whether it meant using chance techniques, chance operations, or finding source texts, or I found Jackson just, again, a wonderful person to bounce ideas of poetry off of. And so he was, in that time period in the early 80s, important to me as I was sort of finding my own way and developing my own aesthetics and values as a poet.
Wonderful. The other, there's so many things to love about that poem, but the other thing I'll observe about it today is that it's in two parts. So it's a sequence, and you, of course, over time become renowned for your draw toward and also facility with the sequence as a form. So yeah, I just wondered if you'd talk about that pull you have as a poet to often write in the sequential mode.
Yes, and just before I do that, let me add one more comment that overflows from the last question and discussion. River River was published by Forrest Gander and C.D. Wright. And so they, Forrest continues to be a good friend and inspiring to me as a poet, and C.D.'s work certainly is really important to me. So, key friendships were forming in that period.
Absolutely.
River River opens with the very first sequence that I wrote, "The Leaves of a Dream" or "The Leaves of an Onion." So River River opens and closes with two sequences. And I was just beginning to find my way in terms of what sequences can do. And I love how I can shift time and place and perspective and voice and create all kinds of tensions and contrasts. There really isn't time today to read a full sequence, but yeah, at least Unnamable River gives a listener of your today a hint of what might be coming.
Definitely, and I hope anyone who wants to go down that path will follow it, because there's so many streams there to explore. But something that you're able to do, and always astonishes me, even in a short space, is what you just said. The sequence allows you to do, which is travel widely through time and space. And so I'm going to encourage our viewers to listen for it as they hear this short poem. That's a new poem. It's in the new poem section of the book, called Invisible Globe.
Invisible Globe. Hiking up a trail in the snow, I spot the rusting orange body of a car. In midwinter, the sun's a mirage of July. A woman begins Tai Chi movements and rotates an invisible globe. A sky blue morning glory unfolds on a fence. Though the movements appear to be stretches, they contain the tips of deflections and strikes. Behind a fence, neighbors drink beer, grill chicken, laugh. As snowflakes drop, I guess at their shapes. 12 branched, stellar dendrite, triangular, capped column. Under a ceiling fan, I recall our hours in a curtained room. And as I sidestep down, a capped column dissolves on my face.
Wow. It's extraordinary. And again, in such a short space, you go through so many seasons and locations, and that directness of being able to see the shape of the snowflake as it hits your face is an astonishing. It just makes my heart leap every time. So it's also, I think, a tribute to another aspect that you're renowned for is observation. And want to pepper in here that you've won so many awards: the National Book Award, Asian American Literary Award, the Jackson Prize, and very recently the Shelley Memorial Award. So congratulations on that one. Quite often, your commentators call out your kind of powers of observation, and I think at least a few times I've seen direct comparisons to folks like William Carlos Williams, that intense observation of reality. So yeah, I wonder if you'd want to say anything about that, and especially maybe as a way to set up the title poem from the book Sightlines, which won the National Book Award just 2 years ago, I think. Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm going to say anything really profound here. Obviously, William Carlos Williams is important to me, and I love how, he could say, take, broken glass in the parking lot and make that shine and make a reader stop and consider and not just sort of pass over it. It was the filmmaker Akira Kurosawa who said, "Never avert your eyes," which I've loved. And that's part of my sense of observation, that I don't want to just look at, say, beautiful details. There are lots of ugly, violent details, and I think of them as slivers that enter my poem, and they need each other to balance each other. Can't just be beautiful, but that the sense of the detail is important to me. It's a kind of luminous shard. It's like maybe the tip of an iceberg. It's hinting at something much larger below surface, something maybe unstated, part of the subtext to the poem. Maybe there's some emotional pressure. I always want to feel that there needs to be, and this is part of the rigor, a necessity for why those details are there. I work hard at them. They're earned. They're not just sort of random or arbitrary. I feel like those details, like the capped column, which is a particular kind of snowflake, right? It lands on the face and then it disappears. It vanishes, which is also part of the ending of the poem. The thing that you finally see, it's like, and then it's gone. those details are just, they're vehicles for me to create something much larger. And maybe that's a good introduction into Sightlines, which I want to say is set in the Milwaukee Valley. It's about 20 miles north of Santa Fe. And let me see, I'm looking for the poem here. And if you walk in that valley, it's northern New Mexico is very dry, but there's a whole irrigation system, what are called acequias, irrigation ditches that run off a river. And then it's a communal situation where people share that water and they grow, apples, lettuce. It's a communal kind of wonderful situation. So it brings people together. And I was walking in that landscape during the dry season. I was walking in the empty ditch thinking about how beautiful this northern New Mexico landscape is. But I was also noticing on the far west, up on a mesa, was Los Alamos, the birthplace of the atom bomb. So like it or not, even in New Mexico, the atomic age is very present. And as I was walking, I was thinking about how I'd never really written a lot about American history. And I thought, well, in the time that, these ditches were running, they weren't actually part of America. And Thomas Jefferson was on the East Coast and he was buying land, making the Louisiana Purchase. They all entered the poem. And my last comment, I know I'm making a lot of comments here, is formally I'm excited about this poem because it was what I call line and circle. It's an experiment in repetition. Each line picks up a word or words from the previous line. And sometimes they're tucked away like the word no inside the word none, but it includes the title. So here it is, Sightlines. I'm walking in sight of the Rio Nambe. Salt cedar rises through silt in an irrigation ditch. The snowpack in the Sangre de Cristos has already dwindled before spring. At least no fires erupt in the conifers above Los Alamos. The plutonium waste has been hauled to an underground site. A man who built plutonium triggers breeds horses now. No one could anticipate this distance from Monticello. Jefferson despised newspapers, but no one thing takes us out of ourselves. During the Cultural Revolution, a boy saw his mother shot by a firing squad. A woman detonates when a spam text triggers bombs strapped to her body. When I come to an upright circular steel lid, I step out of the ditch. I step out of the ditch, but step deeper into myself. I arrive at a space that no longer needs autumn or spring. I find ginseng where there is no ginseng, my talisman of desire. Though you are visiting Paris, you are here at my fingertips. Though I step back into the ditch, no whitening cloud dispels this world's mystery. The ditch ran before the year of the Louisiana Purchase. I'm walking on silt, glimpsing horses in the field, fielding the shapes of our bodies in white sand. Though parallel lines touch in the infinite is here.
Oh, it's devastating, really tremendous. And I'm so glad you said that about the form as well, because this is, in addition to the sequence, I would say this is another signature form for you that I think goes back at least as far as Archipelago, but it becomes more and more present in the work, and it's in some of the new poems too. I want people to know that. What is it that draws you to that particular form? Because it has such force, and I want to say something like anxiety or something in it too, tension.
Well, I think that maybe as an Asian American or just, growing up speaking Chinese, I've always felt that I can admire the Western European forms like the villanelle or the sestina, but they also feel a little alien to me or a little forced. So I feel like, maybe I've tried, in the past writing one or two, and it has just felt stiff or artificial. And so in a way, I've sort of turned to creating or discovering my own forms and ones that maybe are more natural or fluid for me. And part of it has to do with working with the musicality of the poem. And so rather than, say, repeating the same word at the beginning of each line, which of course is a common poetic device, I wanted to play with the idea of having repetitions that were more subtle, that were more woven in. And in this particular piece, Sidelines, I thought, well, what if I just give myself the stricture and see what happens if, in fact, I ask myself, okay, try and make each line pick up a word or words from the previous line. And I thought, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. That's okay. Ultimately, we're trying to write the best poem we can, not fulfill some set of rules, arbitrary rules. But I do find that sometimes these strictures can give a kind of underlying rigor to the poem. And because I like to do lots of wild juxtapositions, that sense of linguistic rigor helps ground the poem if I'm just thinking of repetitions. And again, musicality. So as I was working on the poem, it was just exciting for me to be basically playing with language and experimenting with different possibilities of repetition. And then when it came together, I thought, wow, this actually worked. And I thought, well, I kind of like this idea symbolically of the idea that we think we're going in a line, we're making progress or progression, but we're actually part of a huge circle, or without realizing it, we're just part of this, return. So philosophically, aesthetically, there are implications there, but it was just a fun form for me to work on and develop.
Beautiful. Yeah. It's a pleasure to read, although, like I said, one that has a lot of interesting tension in it too. We keep coming up against those dashes at the end of those lines and feeling hemmed in by them. You mentioned history. Another thing about that poem, and it comes up here and there throughout your work, that line about the Cultural Revolution. And I'm curious as to how you follow that, and did you read the Misty poets? Were you engaging with a discourse of really trying to respond to the kind of global trauma of that historical event?
Where do I start? I think I want to personalize it and just say that a lot of the history of modern China, ancient China is there too, but a lot of the history of modern China is not so much like thinking about something in the abstract, but because my parents were born in China and came to America to go to college, and the Japanese occupation was happening and the Second World War was happening. And my mother's family was fairly affluent, and they lost everything in the Second World War and then the Civil War. And and then relatives from my mother's side of the family came out in 1976, after the Cultural Revolution. And I have an aunt who was tortured during the Cultural Revolution. A lot of these stories are very personal and come out of family history. So they're not like, say, reading something in a newspaper and just saying, oh, I can use that. They're more haunted or haunting for me because they involve immediate family. And then, for instance, seeing my aunt her hand is slightly crippled from various tortures that she had, it's that sense of scarring, and that's also a sense of like, Well, gee, that I was privileged to not, have to suffer or live through that the stories of that era are very much present in my poems.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think, by extension, I mean, I was so thrilled when Sightlines won the National Book Award, because I feel like it's a very political book, and it's a book that really calls us to acknowledge the trauma that's in our world. And as you said eloquently earlier, that we are still in the atomic age somehow. We are still, under the thumb of this monstrosity. So to really grapple with that is brave and necessary and worth recognition. So thank you. Oh wow, there's so much more to say, but I also want to keep hearing poems. So let me ask you to read another poem from Sightlines while we're there. Another one of my favorites, Xeriscape.
Oh, okay. It's another short poem. And of course, the xeriscape is a dry landscape that requires or needs no irrigation. And I think it's okay, since we're just chatting here, to personalize a little background. It's fun to do that. I don't always have that opportunity, but I taught for 22 years at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And though she's not named specifically in this poem, the spark comes from a wonderful poet, D.G. Okpik, who is a Nupiat whose family is at Point Barrow, the northernmost part of North America, basically toward the North Pole. Xeriscape. When she hands you a whale vertebra, you marvel at its heft, at a black pebble lodged in a lateral nook. The hollyhocks out the window stretch into sunshine. A dictionary in the room is open to xeriscape. The sidewalk and gravel heat all day and release warmth into the night. The woman who sits and writes sees pressed aspen board, framers setting window headers and door jambs. Here, no polar bears rummage at the city dump. No seal oil lamps flicker in the tide of darkness. You know the influx of afternoon clouds, thunder, ball lightning, wavering lines of rain that evaporate before they strike the ground. As you carefully set the whalebone on the glass table next to the television.
There's another one of those great juxtapositions, the whalebone next to the television. And that's, again, you're so renowned for that collision of the natural world and the fabricated world, the ancient and the modern. It's dizzying in the best way to be inside an Arthur Sze poem. I wanted to return to something you said earlier about, oh, yes, you were commenting about how that when you got to Berkeley, you were deeply interested in translating classical Chinese poetry. And I wanted to tell readers that that is one little sliver of your history that isn't in the Glass Constellation, although I think it informs it so deeply that I want to recommend to people The Silk Dragon, which collects many of your translations that you published over time. And most beautifully, you have an incredible introduction in which you reveal that you not only began early in your career with translation, but that you've returned to it over time. And I think you say something like that you do that to open up your own poetry, to move forward yourself as a poet. And I'm just fascinated by that and wondering if you could talk a little bit about that process.
Yeah, I never went to graduate school and got an MFA, so I'm an anomaly there. When I was a student at the University of California at Berkeley, I turned to translating the ancient Tang Dynasty poets, Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, the famous ones, because I felt like I could learn from them. And also because when I read translations in English, they felt really flat and they felt like, oh, there's so much more in the Chinese than is here in the English. So that was a spur for me to, on the one hand, take poems that I loved, that I was learning to read in classical Chinese, and say, okay, I'm also a poet. I can learn from this process. Let me try my hand at translating. So, and then I found that it fed me, it gave me ideas as I was translating. It was like stepping into the mind of another artist, another poet. And as I say in the introduction to the Silk Dragon, I would write out the characters word by word, stroke by stroke, character by character, stroke by stroke, to personalize it so that I would slow down the whole process, thinking about how did this character get placed next to that one and what might the poet have been thinking of. And then over time, I found translation at different intervals helpful. I haven't been translating continuously. At a certain point, I thought, well, I want to experiment with voice more. Who can I look to in the Chinese tradition? And Winnie Daw was a poet who was assassinated in 1946 after giving a political speech. But he knew the classical tradition and he was living in modern China, and he subverted a lot of the classical images, and he created his own forms, 9-character lines. And so translating Winnie Daw became really important to me. Again, it made me think about extending the range of my voice. And so over time, I love doing the translations. They're poems that I love. I need to care about them. I once turned down offers to translate poems because they were going to be like on assignment.
Right.
And I don't work like that. I can't do that. I have to, live with these poems and really love them and think, okay, I want to translate this. But at certain key periods, translation has been very helpful to me to sort of think about which direction to go next.
Wonderful. And you've partially answered a question we have from the audience about, but feel free to say more about how do you take advantage of the cultural knowledge from China and use it together with the English language? How do you blend them? And again, I'm going to say it's another thing that you're renowned for, that a lot of not only Chinese words, actually, Japanese culture, Native American culture, Mayan culture, a lot of things that are outside the narrowness of current American experience appear in your poetry and get named and verbalized. So, how does that come about as you're composing?
I think it comes about. This is a difficult a wonderful, challenging question, and it's difficult to respond, in like 2 minutes to it, because I think it's such a really important issue worth a lot of discussion and exploration. But I feel like I am drawing on, Chinese aesthetic principles I've learned. Sometimes there's a particular word, in Chinese or Japanese that I feel like just can't be translated, and then I have to use that word. And for instance, the opening poem to the Glass Constellation is called Before Completion.
Right.
And I don't, need an American reader doesn't necessarily need to know that that's the last name of the hexagram in the I Ching in the Book of Changes. So here I am, not really, I don't think of it as appropriating, as really honoring, as saying, here's work from another tradition. I can draw, and I'm not bound by it. But in the I Ching, it's a system of, say, throwing coins, of divination, of creating a set of 6 lines. And then I thought, and I wrote this after a friend of mine, Gu Chung, the Chinese poet, killed his wife and hanged himself in New Zealand. So it wasn't just an abstract idea, oh, I'll do the I Ching. Actually, Naomi Shihab Nye called me in 1994, and I'll never forget. I was, just stunned. And she said, well, I think Gu Chung, he just killed his wife and hanged himself. I was so stunned. I thought, what can I do with this pain? And I thought, I'd never used the I Ching before. I thought, I'll consult the Oracle and see what it says. And I threw the last hexagram before completion. And I thought, well, here's an image of someone, of a poet, an artist who dies before they get to complete their life. But also I loved the idea that the I Ching ends incomplete. It has after completion and then before completion, so there's never any closure. And then I looked at the structure of the 6 lines, and I thought I could write a poem in 6 sections. So you can begin to see how all of these ideas are coming from a cultural, source, say in ancient China, but I'm adapting it emotionally and imaginatively to the situation at hand.
Yes, and Arthur, I want to thank you also for, in as much as you acknowledge the difficulty and slight absurdity of talking about these profound and sometimes harrowing ideas in such a short form, that you're willing to do so and to do so well, I think is a great gift to us. And I wish we had all day to talk about these, the depths of which poetry is capable in the hands of a person like you who has dedicated their entire life to it. But your answers, though short, are quite profound. I don't want to mistake that. I also loved, by the way, that you mentioned that Before Completion is the first poem in this book, because, and I thought this was such a signature Arthur Sze thing, that many times collected poems will either open with the new poems or close with the new poems, as this does. But this opens with what were in 1998 the new poems from the Red Shifting Web, but in essence we're starting in the middle of your work, and there's something so beautiful about that, and so it's such an interesting place to step in to a lifetime of poetry. How did that choice come about, actually?
It has an antecedent with the Red Shifting Web, the earlier collected that I put together, which was that when I put that collection together, I looked at my early poems from Berkeley and from when I first moved to Santa Fe, and I thought, they're okay, but they're not really that striking, or poems that I feel like, wow, this is, where I'm really hitting my stride. And I thought, rather than do something just chronological, I thought, well, I don't follow that in my own poetry. Why should I follow that in the collected? And so as I was thinking of the Glass Constellation, I thought, I want to start the collection with a set of poems that are, signature poems, that are poems I truly believe in, that I feel like these are original, these have a kind of field of energy that marks something distinctive. So there are actually 5 sequences: Before Completion, the String Diamond, Kaiseki, Apache Plume, and 6 Persimmons. So it's like 5 very different sequences, radical sequences in a row. And I thought, now that's the way to start. And then let the reader see where I started chronologically, go up, and then keep going. And then it made sense to put the new poems at the very end.
Right. It's wonderful. And also want to give a shout out to your longtime publisher, Copper Canyon Press, a champion of poetry in our country. Endless thanks to them, and especially to Michael Wiegers there. I think one of the heroes, behind the scenes heroes, who make so much good things happen. for poetry lovers here. So, Arthur, it has been just amazing to spend this time with you. I can't believe it's almost over, but I'm going to ask if we might end going back even a little bit further than we have so far in the Glass Constellation. I think I may have told you this, but the very first poem I ever read by you took my head off, just like Emily Dickinson says a poem should. And I knew I would be a faithful reader of yours forever. So I feel a little bit like someone at a concert holding up their lighter and calling out for their favorite song, but I'm going to do it anyway and ask if you'll close our time together by reading the title poem of your third book, Dazzled.
I'd love to do that. And just before I do that, I also want to give a moment of thanks to Michael Wiegers, who joined Copper Canyon, I believe, in 1994, and I joined later toward the end of that year, so we go back a long ways. And Michael has believed in my work for so many years, and I'm just so grateful to Michael and the press. So here's Dazzled. Reality is like a contemporary string quartet. The first violinist puts on a crow's head, and the cellist soliloquizes on a white lotus in the rain. The violist discusses love, rage, and terror. And the second violinist reports on the latest coup in Afghanistan. A gazelle leaps in October light. I am dazzled.
Arthur, we are dazzled as well. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for this gift. And to our viewers out there, treat yourself or someone you love to some of the best poetry being made right now. Thank you again, Arthur, and to all, good night.
Thank you so much.